So welcome everyone. Today we're going to be chatting about resiliency, and we are very fortunate to have Laura van Dernoot Lipsky joining us from the state of Washington. Welcome, Laura. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So, this channel is really just about having a conversation, talking about resiliency and talking about ways in which we can learn from it. We can really just talk about what it means and how it impacts everyone. When we hear the word resiliency, especially during these unprecedented and unique times, what does that mean? Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's a great question. I think people define it different ways. For me, much of what I think about is how do we sustain? So how do we sustain for the next hour? How do we sustain for a day? How do we sustain for a week? And I think that conversation about how to make this a sustainable time for ourselves feels particularly important because one of the things that's so challenging right now with the pandemic is we don't know if there's an end in sight and when there's an end in sight. And as you know, humans, we do much better if we know, like, here's what we need to get to, or you have some sense of, not to compare suffering, but here's how long it might take to repair after an earthquake, or here's how long it might take for a community to cycle through this type of tragedy. But with what's happening right now, I think part of what's really weighing on people is, since we have no idea really how long this is going to be unfolding for and what is going to happen as a result of that, I think that's wearing on people in a really specific way. And so when we talk about resilience, when we talk about how to sustain, you'll hear people say, like, every 10 minutes feels like a week, so it's kind of that time warp experience. And so really figuring out some concrete practices of how we can make it through.
I think that's a great point, because too often we look at life and we say, okay, beginning, middle, and end. So we're used to knowing, are we halfway through something? We just have to go through a little bit more. And we've been all experiencing, in a way, endless nows. Like, there's a constant now. We're present, we're in the moment, and we don't know how long now is going to last, even though it's happening in the moment. So when we're thinking about getting to the next moment, or thinking about having a day that we can handle, and then the following day might be a little bit more challenging, where do we start?
One of the things that we talk a lot about with trauma, and that we talk a lot about with vicarious trauma, or that kind of cumulative toll over time of what gets hard when we're exposed to overwhelming things, or when we talk about overwhelm, is how can we take care of our nervous system, and how can we be very mindful and intentional about what conditions we have in place to, a way we talk about it is, how do you metabolize what you're experiencing? How do you metabolize what you're bearing witness to? And how do you metabolize everything you're navigating kind of atmospherically, right? So currently there's people's own conditions, and also there is so much cognitive overload right now and decision fatigue, because even if you're really being intentional about not exposing yourself to the news, even if that's the case, you're still having to triage decision after decision after decision. So when we talk about how to metabolize, there's both what's out there, like really large macro, and then there's everything that you're having to metabolize from immensely significant loss and fear and terror and what it means. And then there's all the other things of grieving, one's routine, grieving your kids getting to be in school, grieving, your child's choir practice, that was the highlight of their week, or grieving their sports season, grieving all the graduations. So there's a whole continuum of just ineffable suffering that's happening. And then there's also, logistics, and then there's also all these other losses, right? So when we talk about metabolizing, part of what we want to pay attention to is how do you create conditions that can encompass all of that, right? So the really, really, really intense magnitude that we're navigating, as well as all these other pieces, which can maybe seem small, but they also really accumulate, you know? And part of what we're going for with metabolizing is allowing this to move through our nervous system, right? Because we all have so many different beliefs and, you know, cultures and what your beliefs are religiously, spiritually, everything. But most of us appreciate neuroscience. So if you just come from that place of how can I be very intentional about what I'm exposing myself to, right? And then how can I move it through my nervous system so nothing's accumulating in me such that I get saturated and then start, you know, a slow or rapid hemorrhaging out.
Yeah. So what I'm really hearing is like, we're all trying to slow it down and see what works for us for our own filters. And based on our experiences and based on how we process information, if we're able to just pause and slow down a little bit and say, you know, I have to be in tune with what I'm feeling right now. Yeah. And if I'm exposing myself to either too much media or too much of my cell phone or too much of 5 different experts having 5 different opinions about the same topic, then I need to tune in with myself and say, well, what works for me? And what works for me might be very different than what might work for my friend or my colleague or someone that's living in the same state or the same town as me.
Yes.
So really kind of looking at ourselves and looking at how we process and how we handle this information.
Yes. And part of what you're bringing up there, which presents a particular challenge, is I do think for us to be able to sort out what conditions do we want in place to be able to metabolize what's arising in us and what we're experiencing so we can find a sustainable way through. That requires, as you're saying, that we're contemplative and we have some capacity to self-reflect. Mm-hmm. And what we know is frequently as humans, when we are experiencing really hard things, we're often not wanting to be self-reflective or contemplative. We're wanting to be much more externally focused because to, you know, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, to look deeply within, that can be immensely painful, and it can be the degree of vulnerability that so many of us feel right now can really, really in of itself be overwhelming. So it does mean that, you know, even if you're not doing like a really deep dive into being introspective, as you're saying, having some ability to check in with your nervous system, having some ability to check in with your breath, having some ability to check in with, you know, if you have that tightness in your chest or your gut, something to be able to be like, maybe I should not have the news playing while I also have a podcast going, while I also have my best friend on the phone where everybody's saying the world is ending. Maybe I should not have that on, right? You know, like something. If it's not a really extreme contemplative moment, but something where you're able to really gauge, like right now, you know, is this edifying, right? Or is this really eroding my spirit? You know, does this feel nourishing, or does this feel like I'm just absorbing a huge amount of toxicity?
Yeah, and it sounds like it doesn't have to be this large, insightful, I'm going to unpack and do all this work. It can be very simple to just say, how am I handling this right now, and be in tune with your body, be in tune with your backache or, you know, a headache or something that might feel a little off kilter, and then recognize, okay, well, let me just connect the dots just for a second, and let me say, well, maybe it could be because of something I was just exposed to, or a conversation with someone, or, you know, that topic, whatever it is. So really, it sounds like it's something very simple that we can do by just taking a step back. And it's not this overwhelming, I need to lie down on a couch and think about my childhood. And you know, what I wanted to do is bring up, because I think it's a beautiful guide, is the Tiny Survival Guide that was produced from the Trauma Stewardship Institute. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I got to work with 3 teenagers in my life who are brilliant and very, very talented and gifted. And we put together this Tiny Survival Guide. And to your point of it's going to be different for everybody. What's helpful, that's true. And it varies by, in this 15 minutes, here's what's helpful. And then next hour, here's what's helpful. And then the afternoon, here's what's helpful. So that's true. And also we do know that there are some practices that are generally very efficient, very effective, and don't cost money. And so that's what we wanted to put on the survival guide, that it's how this rolls out will be different for everybody in terms of what they call on, but we did want to bring people's attention to some things that, assuming if you don't have a lot of cash and you don't have a lot of time, and frankly, you might just have zero inspiration, or just be resentful that we have to do anything. Like we're adding anything to our list right now. But we know that there's some practices we can call on that are just that we can do. So I would say, some of the ones that we really draw people's attention to is, and this is, across cultures and from the beginning of time, that what our ancestors did to get through really hard times and sustain was engage their breath in an intentional way to re-regulate their nervous system. Okay, so this can range from meditation to what we see a lot now, which is, unless you're medically advised against it, getting your heart rate up and breaking a sweat regularly, right? And that can be playing the saxophone. That can be doing one of the million free workouts online. That can be running stairs, that can be doing yoga, like so many options to what that looks like. But we do know that regularly being able to do something with your breath, right, where you can flush out your nervous system and you can really re-regulate your nervous system and reset your nervous system, that is immensely, immensely significant.
And I think it's great that you had mentioned that they're very simple. They're free to do. You don't have to go out to Home Depot or to go get all these supplies. And it really kind of breaks it down into these small little activities that can be done at any moment. I'm thinking of laughter, right? And that comes back to your point about the breath. And if you're able to laugh and to get some of that forced air out, and to release some endorphins, like there's so many different layers of how a small activity like that can really impact your body and really help you during these these unprecedented times.
Right. Yeah. We have gratitude, having a gratitude practice on there. And again, I'm not attached to what language people use. Some people appreciate the word gratitude. Others, it's like nails on a chalkboard. So I don't care how people frame it, but anybody who's survived these big waves in life know that few things help us get through more reliably than an ability to find meaning and an ability to continue to reflect on anything that's going well, right? Like, that could just be a life-saving, like every 60 seconds, trying to be like, is anything going well right now? Is anything going, and then building on that. And so having a gratitude practice, where you just set alarms to go on your phone to remind you, a few times a day to pause just for a microsecond and think, is anything right now, like, what is one thing I'm grateful for right now? Yeah. And that's in no way to negate the profound degree of suffering. It's a way to just like help us, form, stone by stone, a path across this like rushing river that many of us are watching, and like with a lot of fear, Mm-hmm. And so being able to just acknowledge that, like, it takes no time to do that, but to be able to just bring to the fore of our mind, okay, what's one thing that is going well? What is one thing I can be grateful for, And I think that, combined with what we talked about earlier, another piece we have on here is about protecting your morning and also being really intentional about just simple exposure, right? So that you don't wake up to social media, you don't wake up to the news. You really try to come into a waking state, if possible, with as little cortisol in your system, and then for the rest of the day, being really intentional about, do I need to expose myself to this conversation? Do I need to expose myself to this podcast? Do I need to expose myself to this news channel? Yeah. Because nothing needs to be harder for ourselves right now. And the conditions you're going to need in place to metabolize this we want to be really realistic about what we can do to metabolize this. And if you're just exposing yourself to wave after wave after wave of near impossible things to metabolize, then it's going to be a setup. So one of the most sound practices we can do is be really diligent, about like, if you see one of your in-laws calling and you're like, this is probably, I have a sense where this conversation is going to go, and I generally don't get off the phone feeling awesome, then you might want to have that conversation later. If there's a work colleague that maybe it's better to email with than, do a whole meeting with. And then news, social media is another one where you can really give yourself a lot more breathing room if we're intentional about that, and either actively engaging or having it on as background noise.
Yeah. And, the great thing about these resources, and we're going to put them in the description to this video, is that they're accessible. They're on PDF files. They're linked to your site. So they're really just like a click away. And I think you could share them with anyone. You could share them with your family members, your colleagues, your friends, and really just kind of learn from each other as far as what's working and what something that we might think we might either take for granted or assume, like sleep, right? And I'm sure in this space that we're all in right now, if there are people that are working from home, sleep might take on a different, it might look differently than if we were to be waking up at 5:30, 6 every morning to get ready, commute, get the kids on the bus, things like that. So I think in the space of having limited structure, for us to take that time to build in that structure with these coping skills, and really I kind of think of them as very quick resources that we can utilize. I think they'd be really valuable.
And part of the undercurrent with all of this is, what are some ways that we can be mindful about how we're spending our time and conducting ourselves during these ineffable times, so that we can get through this experience with as little harm being done as possible, right? Yep. Like, there's the COVID piece, but there's also all the other subsequent harm in terms of harm to our personal relationships, harm to our own mental health, right? Harm to how we are with other people, our colleagues. Like, you can be doing tremendous work, but maybe not treating our colleagues well. So really trying to be as mindful as possible of, let's not make anything harder for ourselves. And part of what that means is we want to, dial down any potential harm, right? That, and to do that means that we're not wanting people to kind of suck it up during this time, and then come out in 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, and then realize, oh, my kids aren't talking to me anymore because I was such a nightmare. 3 of my colleagues don't want to be in my presence anymore, right? Or we don't want to come out of this. Maybe, we don't contract COVID, but our anxiety is off the charts. Yeah. We've gotten into a sleep habit that is wholly unsustainable. And so I think that whole frame of, let us get through this, we're trying to mitigate whatever harm, there is, and then just refraining from causing harm to the best of our ability, and understanding that even if you don't feel like participating in these practices, even if you don't think you have time, even if you're like lacking any inspiration, it is going to be imperative that we do a number of things on a regular basis to make sure we are not internalizing what's unfolding. We're not swallowing what's unfolding, and we're not just frozen up in this time thinking, I'm just going to suck it up, and then I'm going to come out the other end and kind of pick up where I left off.
Yeah. And that's a really great point. And the one thing I wanted to mention while we have a little bit more time left is, very often there's a sense of, when we're asking each other, how are you doing? Yeah. The quick response is, I'm fine. Yeah. Or I should be okay. And we're not allowing ourselves to feel and allowing ourselves to say, you know what, I am having a bit of a hard time. Yeah. And so much of that is stigma. So much of that is, let me push through. Let me, if I close my eyes and move forward, I don't have to think about what I'm feeling in the moment. So when a lot of us are in that space, or we're seeing a colleague or a friend that is constantly saying, "Oh, I'm okay, I'm doing okay, I'm fine, this is okay," how do we help support them? How do we basically say, it's okay not to be okay?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few, I mean, one thing is, instead of saying, how are you feeling? One thing we can say is like, what are you feeling? Like getting more specific, like, what's up? Like, how's your day to day? Like getting much more specific with it. I think the other piece, I mean, we appreciate gratitude and we appreciate people having context, right? So people being able to say, hey, like, yeah, this is a drag, a lot going on. I mean, man, I'm so grateful to have a roof over my head and my partner hasn't lost their job. And, we really appreciate context. What we don't want to do is endorse minimizing, right? So what we don't want to do is get into this thing like somehow it's a competition of suffering and we start putting everybody's pain on a hierarchy. And so, if you're not on a ventilator and everyone you love is not on a ventilator, then you don't have any reason to complain. Like we don't want to get into that competition of suffering. So I think we talk a lot with trauma about creating equanimity, so there's space for everything, right? So that there's enough space to be able to acknowledge the blessings, acknowledge everything we're grateful for, have some perspective, have some context. And then if you're in a bad mood for an hour or a day, you can be in a bad mood for an hour or a day, right? If you don't even know why you feel so sad and you do realize you have a huge amount of privilege, it's like waves, like you just like let the waves wash over you. You don't have to go up against the waves. You're not going to try to fight the waves. You're not going to resist the wave. Just, you're going to let them wash over you. And a lot is not going to make sense right now. I mean, I'm talking to so many people who are just, people like, I feel so tired. I feel so uncreative. Like I feel my brain is broken. I'm drinking 40 cups of coffee a day and somebody must have switched it with decaf. Like people are just, I think it's also there's a lot of confusion in terms of why we're feeling the way we are. So I think trying to have some grace with ourselves, trying to have some humility, trying to have some sense of humor, as you said. And so if you see somebody having some context, you can be like, yeah, I really appreciate that. And also, it's still like, sounds like you got a lot going on, having 3 kids at home who you're homeschooling, man, like deep bow to you on that, like being able to acknowledge, right? And then I think anytime we see people getting into this like minimizing or kind of a competition of suffering, being able to respectfully reframe that as well, I think is important too.
This is great stuff. That's I think it's so valuable to hear from your perspectives and your experiences, how we can, again, just really think about resiliency, think about how it can be built over time. It's not something that you just turn on and off. And it's something that's present with us, in this moment. And it's these little baby steps that we could all take to really kind of mitigate the harm and to make sure that we're being in tune with our own bodies and we're, staying safe out there. So Laura, I want to thank you for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. And, the resources are in our description in the link. And we want to be able to just share the message and, continue to have the conversations about this because like we had started off with, we're all in this present now, and we don't really have an end date. There are thoughts about it, but it's that unknown. And I think when we're all in that space of the unknown, if we're able to have conversations and bring them up to the surface, we're going to be able to build our resilience. Yes. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And if I can answer any further questions or anything, folks can come through our website, but we avail ourselves.
Great.